Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi teaches at the University of Tehran in Iran. Professor Marandi, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
I found your recent monologue on the YouTube channel Al Mayadin English very interesting. And the title of that is Demystifying Iran, Iran and Palestine, a Steadfast Commitment. So before we deep dive into some of the content of your monologue, if you could tell us a little bit about what is the platform and what kind of a show you are doing there.
Sure. This is Mayadeen English or Al Mayadeen, which belongs to the Al Mayadeen channel. It's spelled Mayadeen English both on YouTube and their Twitter account if people would subscribe, and it would be helpful to them because they are pro resistance and they focus on the region. They asked me to do a weekly monologue, and I've agreed to do that. It will be every week on Fridays. It'll be about 20 some minutes, and the first two have been broadcast. One uh, last night, the second one last night, and of course next Friday there'll be a third, and this will continue for the time being until it reaches a point where I burn out.
And the show that I watched, it was titled Demystifying Iran, Iran and Palestine. And I wonder if you could tell us what was your intention to demystify? What were the set of things that you wanted to demystify about Iran there? And why is it called Iran and Palestine? In other words, what's the centrality of Palestine in demystifying Iran?
Well, the first show was about a number of myths on Iran, like proxies, things that we've discussed actually in before, but sort of more focused and more systematic. And uh, in other myths, major myths in the Western media. And the second one, which was shown last night, was about Iran and Palestine. And the third one will probably be about the nuclear program for next week. But the one on Palestine basically uh, it explains the history of the Iranian relationship with the Palestinian movements. And I showed that the revolutionaries, long before 1979, they were advocating for Palestinians and for South Africans who are resisting apartheid, or people in Southern Africa who are resisting apartheid. And two of the major grievances towards the Shah, besides his despotism and the waste of oil wealth for his own selfish gains and for his own entourage, two of the major grievances were the Palestinian issue and the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so this goes before far. The roots of all this uh, go far before the revolution. And then I explained how Iran and the PLO, their relationship grew and then declined as the PLO um, moved towards uh, compromise, a compromise that the Iranians believed will get it nowhere, and ultimately it didn't get anywhere. The Oslo process and the other events that you and I know about, and then Iran's relationship with Hamas. But I think one of the interesting things in the relationship between Iran and the PLO and Iran and Hamas, one um, element that existed in both relationships was that regardless of the behavior or of the other side, Iran continued to support the Palestinian movement. In other words, when the PLO moved towards the U.S.-led peace process, Iran did not forsake the Palestinian cause. And when the political wing of Hamas, not the entire movement, but the political wing of Hamas, when it began supporting the dirty war in Syria, at the U.S.-led dirty war in Syria, again, Iran did not relinquish its relationship. It continued to support Hamas in the resistance. So, regardless of what Iran thought about what the PLO was doing, falling into a U.S. trap, or Hamas, was the political wing of Hamas was doing, which was also falling into a U.S. trap, Iran continued to support the Palestinian movements and the Palestinian cause.
I want to pick up some of these events and go through them little bit in a little bit more detail. So, if you could start with the relationship between Shah and Iran. You do mention in your monologue about the periphery doctrine in Israel. Many of our viewers might or may not be familiar with this idea that during the peak of the Arab nationalism, there was this doctrine among the early Zionists that that Israel should be close to the peripheries or the non-core Arab states, and Iran was a fit to that. But I'm curious if you could tell our viewers the motivation of Shah towards having this close, not very open, but having this close relationship with the Zionist entity.
Sure. Just one thing that I should add is that the difficulties between the political wing of Hamas and Iran were during the previous decade. After that was during the period when Khalid Mash'al was the head of the political wing. Again, the military wing was separate. It did not affect that relationship, Iran's relationship with the military wing. But after Khalid Mash'al stepped down, Hamas, and also after they saw the U.S. involvement in Syria, Hamas had a much a more cautious approach, and the political wing, and the relationship between Iran and Hamas went back to normal. We have to remember that Syria was important for Iran's support for Hamas because it was basically the point where the logistical uh, area where Iran supported all the a lot of the resistance groups, including Hamas itself. So by breaking the relationship with the Syrian government, it made it much more difficult for Iran to support the resistance, some of the resistance groups at that time. And now, of course, with the fall of Syrian, the fact that the United States now dominates the Israeli regime and the Americans, thanks to Erdogan and Qatar and others who brought about this catastrophe, and helped starve the Syrian people and destroy the country by aiding this dirty war. Now, of course, it's much more difficult. But going back to the question that you raised, um, Iran's support for the Palestinian cause um, before the revolution, uh, as I said, was one moment was about over a decade before the revolution was when Ayatollah Imam Khomeini gave a fatwa about supporting the Palestinian resistance. And remember, back then there was no internet or there was no satellite TV even. And so for younger people, it's very difficult to even imagine what the world was like back then. So for the different revolutionary and anti-imperialist movements in our part of the world and beyond, communicating was not the easiest thing to do. But in any case, he gave that support. Uh, the Shah, of course, he established very good ties with the Israeli regime, and he ultimately became its number one it provided the number one exporter of oil to the regime was Iran. I think maybe half of the oil that went to the regime came from Iran. Sort of like what Erdogan is doing today. Erdogan has sort of replaced the Shah of Iran in supporting the Israeli regime. And of course, in addition to the Israeli regime, Iran was providing almost all of apartheid South Africa's oil. I think up to 90% of the apartheid regime's oil came from Iran. So the Shah was both supporting apartheid in Palestine and supporting apartheid in Southern Africa. And also there's another interesting footnote that Iran it purchased jets from the United States, military aircraft, and sent some of them to Vietnam for the Americans to use to bomb the Vietnamese. So Iran purchased expensive fighter aircraft from the United States and then gave them to the United States to use against the poor people of Vietnam who were basically defending their homeland. So this was, and if you look at what the region is like today, the Shah was basically what these other regimes in the region are like today, right? In the American camp, we just heard that Egypt and the Israeli regime have signed a huge contract for Cairo to receive natural gas from Israel, huge quantities, and of course it's business as usual between Turkey and the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Israeli regime. And now we are hearing the Emirates purchasing huge quantities of Israeli military hardware. It's as if these countries want to strengthen the Israeli regime instead of punishing it for the Holocaust that it's been carrying out in Gaza and killing people. Last night we saw they hit a wedding again in Gaza. But in any case, the Shah had that sort of relationship, and the Shah did not like the rise of Arab nationalism. Instead of welcoming it, he was happy to see the Israelis defeat the Arab armies. And while the Israeli regime had a policy, as you pointed out, of establishing relationships with countries beyond the Arab region, meaning Iran and Turkey, or back then Turkey, that sort of was a policy that was welcomed by the Shah of Iran. And he had a policy of strengthening ties with the Israeli regime because he felt that he and the Israeli regime had similar interests against Jamal Abdel Nasser and the rise of Arab nationalism. And so the Shah back then was basically in the camp of the same regimes today that are in the American camp and working with the Israeli regime. And the revolution brought that to a sudden end. Iran's military purchases, Iran's intelligence cooperation, Iran's exports, all exports and imports were cut immediately after the revolution. One myth, by the way, that I did not address in this monologue, because it's really, there's not much time. It sounds like it seems when you want to start writing for it that you'll not. I sort of think that I won't have enough material, and then I have to cut everything just to get it all, get it in. One of the myths is the claim that Iran purchased weapons from the Israeli regime in the 1980s, the Iran-Contra affair, which I'll get to momentarily. But in any case, Iran cut off all ties with the Israeli regime and all ties with the apartheid regime in South Africa, and began to support the resistance in Southern Africa, because it wasn't just South Africa, and also the first foreign dignitary that came to Iran was Yasser Arafat. And Iran immediately after the revolution, when they shut down the Israeli embassy, when he arrived in the Palestinian embassy, and it is in what is now Palestine Square. It's right beside the square. Now, going back to what I did not address in the monologue because of a shortage of time, and also I wasn't really thinking about it until after someone commented on it afterwards, is the claim that Iran purchased weapons from the Israeli regime, which is absolutely untrue. Iran never purchased any weapons from the Israeli regime. Iran purchased weapons from the black market. And in the black market, there were sellers from all over the world. In fact, even Hamas would buy uh, weapons from soldiers in the Israeli regime, illegally, and they'd pay them and smuggle in uniforms and weapons to use against the Israelis. So the Iranians never purchased anything from the regime. The United States, in its engagement with Iran, at one point used sent weapons from Israel to Iran, but the Iranians had no idea that these were from Israel. They were not dealing with the regime; they were dealing with um, Reagan, the U.S. president at that time. And if I recall correctly, I'll look this up. But on one occasion, they discovered Hebrew writings on some of the weapons that the Americans were supposed to be providing, and the Iranians rejected them. And even back then, Imam Khomeini commented on this, and he said they make this accusation against Iran because the Israeli regime, it's a sort of admission that the Israeli regime is so filthy that they want to associate Iran with the regime to make Iran filthy too, or look filthy. So he was saying that the Americans and the West, by trying to associate Iran with the Israeli regime, they were indirectly admitting that the Israeli regime has, it has an ugly nature. But and it doesn't coincide with other uh, realities that we saw in the 1980s, because this accusation was made about the mid 1980s. At that time, Iran was supporting the resistance in Lebanon. They expelled the Israeli regime, and ultimately in the year 2000, they were expelled. Iran, of course, as I said, was supporting the PLO and recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So it doesn't make sense. And it's basically an attempt by those regimes and the people on the payroll of those regimes in the region to damage Iran's image in order to hide their own complicity. Because none of these governments are doing anything about about what's going on in Palestine. None of the countries in the region, from Turkey to Egypt, from Morocco, to Syria today, or the Emirates. None of them are doing anything for the Palestinians, and it's Iran. So one way, in order to sort of uh, strengthen your hand, would be to to try to um, discredit others. In other words, in order to lessen the ugliness of your complicity, your cooperation with the Israeli regime, the best thing to do is to try to discredit those who are not behaving as you are.
I wanted to ask you about the centrality of 1979 in resetting the geopolitics in the region from Iranian perspective, and how did Iran became one of the centers of support for Palestinian resistance against Zionism and colonialism. Given the 1970s were interesting, in one way, the Shah was getting very close to Egypt. And of course, there was it, Arab nationalism was retreating as Sadat and others decided to make peace with Israel that culminated in the Camp David that was in the Mediterranean. But on the Iranian side, there was the revolution. So, if you could tell our viewers the ideological content of that revolution and how did that fit to resetting of the geopolitical dynamics in the region.
Sure. I do, explain. I do give a sort of background to the issue, and I think you have kindly put it in at the bottom of the uh, beneath, beneath the video. But in 1979, when the revolution took place, uh, the revolution was an anti-imperialist. movement. It was an anti-colonial and neo-colonial and anti-apartheid movement, and it began supporting movements across the world that were against U.S. imperialism in Latin America. So Iran, although being an Islamic republic, Iran was supporting Cuba, and in fact, Iran's healthcare network, which is one of the most advanced in the world, and research has been done on it. There are certain similarities between the Cuban experience and the Iranian experience. And Iranian officials went to Cuba to look at their experience to improve the healthcare network that they were building after the revolution. So, um, but of course, I mean, there are certain similarities with leftist movements, social justice and their anti-imperialist aspirations, but also Iran is in many ways similar to conservatives, family values, the support of but and somewhere in between, by the way, when it comes to uh, some issues that are controversial in the United States, like abortion. But in any case, moving beyond that, uh, the this was a major boost for the uh, resistance against the Israeli regime. And that is one reason why both the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, basically united in their support for Saddam Hussein and their encouragement for him to invade Iran, and that basically became an existential battle for the Iranians because it was fighting in both blocs, and of course Arab regimes in the region with their oil and gas. Oil back then it was just oil well, but they were providing hundreds of billions of dollars to Saddam Hussein. So Iran, it was more difficult for Iran to support these movements, but it did. It continued to support them, despite the fact that it was battling uh, both empires at the same time. Um, but also one important point is that I think your viewers would be interested is that we know that the Saudis and the Americans and they were funding Wahhabism and Salafism against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And we know that the first Takfiri books, actually, before the Saudis had the capabilities to publish, were published in the United States at the Nebraska Omaha University. I mean, people can search this online. But it wasn't just about the Soviet Union, it was also about Iran, because the Saudis and these Arab family dictatorships in the region, they were worried about the popularity of the revolution, and they were all in the American camp, proxies with very little credibility when you compare them to a revolutionary movement that supports Palestine and which relies on the public. They began to support their support for Wahhabism and Salafism was also in order to create hatred among Sunnis, uh, and thus create a divide and prevent the revolution from growing because people would start hating Iran and hating the Shia, and that would be the best way to contain the revolution. And it was effective, and it created a lot of misery, a lot of the misery that we see today across the world, whether it's Boko Haram, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in Syria or Libya or Pakistan or Afghanistan and elsewhere. This misery is due to those U.S. policies, which was funded by their proxies. So a lot of the misery that we see today is because the United States was using Salafism and Wahhabism not just against the Soviet Union but against Iran. And of course, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they continued to use it. After 9/11, and 9/11 nowadays is becoming more controversial, especially after Tucker Carlson's documentary and the role that the deep state and the Israeli regime probably played in this, or their intelligence agencies. But but it's extraordinary that even after 9/11, the United States when they began the counter-revolution during the Arab Spring. They used the same proxies in Libya and then in Syria. They also tried using them in Yemen to less success. But Wahhabism and Salafism has been a tool that the United States has been using extensively since the revolution to divide and rule the region.
Can you also tell us the region behind the Soviet Union supporting Saddam Hussein? I haven't read well enough about this episode. Was it the fear of spread of political Islam to Central Asian republics, or what was the reason?
Yes, of course, political Islam has different meanings. In the case of Iran, they see it as a liberation movement, a popular movement, and very unlike what the West tries to depict it to be. The Wahhabi and Salafi Islam, from the Iranian perspective, is CIA Islam, and it has been used throughout these decades in order to preserve Western domination and Western hegemony. I was just saying a while back that you see how ISIS and Al Qaeda have been focused on bombing, carrying out attacks in Iran, Russia. We saw what happened in Chechnya, in Syria, and everywhere, but not in Israel. Uh, never Israel, even against Hamas, against Hezbollah, of course, but never against Israel, never against the Israeli regime. So that political so-called Islam, Wahhabism, and Salafism, I think, is that's just CIA Islam. CIA Islam. But yes, the Soviet Union was afraid that the Iranian movement, being a popular revolution, being anti-imperialist, it was a threat to the Soviet Union, both because the Soviet Union saw itself as the anti-imperialist force, but also because it had, because of Central Asia and the Caucasus, it felt vulnerable because it was very oppressive in these areas and preventing people from even expressing any sort of religiosity, whether Christian or Muslim, no difference. But in any case, the Soviet Union felt that Iran was a threat, and they provided Saddam Hussein with all sorts of weapons, missiles to strike Iranian cities. The Americans and the Europeans, NATO, they provided Saddam with jets. So did the Soviet Union, but with chemical weapons. And the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and others, they were providing a huge amount of funding. So it was a huge collaboration. And fighters from 19 countries were actually uh, fighting for Saddam Hussein's army, including, by the way, the MEK terror organization, the Iranian MEK terror organization, which went to Iran and acted as foot soldiers for Saddam Hussein. The MEK terror organization right now is basically a proxy today for the United States and the Israeli regime.
The Soviet Union was also traditional sellers of weapons to all the core Arab states, and that included Iraq. So I think there was the
That's right.
country. Uh,
Also, a major conflict between Iran and the Soviet Union was the occupation of Afghanistan.
right.
Even though it was Americans, as we now know, who encouraged this, we know that Brzezinski and Carter funded groups in order to encourage the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. In other words, Carter, who is a so-called human rights president, he sacrificed the country of Afghanistan in order to hurt the Soviet Union. But in any case, when the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan, Iran supported the Afghan people, and that was also um, a reason for the two countries uh, uh, to have poor relations. As when Gorbachev became president, relations began to get better because the Soviet Union was becoming more inward-looking. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Iran's relationship with Russia improved significantly, and it has been growing ever since. And it really improved significantly after the war in Ukraine. So the relationship between Iran and Russia today is a world away. It's completely different from Iran's relationship with the Soviet Union in the early and mid 1980s.
A lot of people are not probably familiar with Iranian history and how it had to live under shadows of empires, and the Russian Empire, and later the sphere of Soviet Union was one of the burning question, if you like, in Iran. In fact, the Shah, you can call it a defense of the Shah, but there are historians that says that Shah, one of the reasons Shah tilted towards the U.S. was because he thought that not failing to do that would make Iran a to live under the shadows of the Soviet Union. Justified or
Well,
not, that's said.
one thing that I'm trying to do in this series, in these weekly monologues on Mayadeen English, is to sort of discuss an issue per week to sort of clarify things, to sort of brief introduction. Because, for example, right now or on other occasions, you and I discuss different things, and some things may be difficult to understand for someone who hasn't doesn't know the background. So what I'm trying to do is to make that a bit clearer. But of course, the Shah was brought, the Americans brought him to power when, in 1953, the United States and the British carried out a coup in Iran, and the Shah was basically their proxy and their man in Tehran. And so until the very end, he was firmly in the American camp. And his behavior was very similar to Arab countries in the Persian Gulf region today. In other words, for example, Iran would buy huge amounts of American weapons, but it wasn't even allowed to touch the advanced weapons. So, for example, we purchased F-14s, but American advisors were the ones who would open it up, and if there were repairs to be made or if things were to be checked, they would do it. So the Iranian engineers and experts were not even allowed to deal with their own weapon systems. And it was only after the revolution, when Saddam invaded Iran, that the Iranians began to, young Iranians began to try to uh, work and find out how to repair these weapons so that they could use them to defend the country. So the Shah purchased all sorts of weapons, brought in tens of thousands of military advisors, very similar to what we're seeing in other countries in the Persian Gulf today, simply milking the country. And when the revolution happened, I think only 40% of Iranians uh, could read and write. So despite all the oil wealth, 40% of Iranians, and most of them were male, most of them were males. After the revolution, immediately after the revolution, there was a mobilization effort for universal education. And the 1980s, despite the war, despite the Saddam Hussein's war with US and Soviet Union support and support from the Europeans, the Iranians carried out a national literacy program and literally within a somewhat brief period of time brought about almost universal education, both for women and for men. And so it's very different from the mythologies that come out of Western media and Western think tanks, that during the Shah's time, Iran was, fantastic and progressive, and after the revolution, it was actually the exact opposite. But history is not something that many of us are acquainted with. Just as um, unfortunately, even we are often unfamiliar with our own history, let alone the history of sister countries which have similar experiences with uh, empire and imperialism and colonialism and neocolonialism.
I interviewed. We actually haven't published that. We would probably do it soon. I interviewed Wali Nasser. I'm not sure if you have read his book. He wrote a book covering Iranian history. I mean, it was definitely soft on the Shah and unfair to the Iranian Revolution and its aftermath. But yeah, it's a documentation of events, and one of the things the book wrote, the book said was that. Uh, After the Second World War, there were two strategies from within Iran regarding foreign policy about how to maintain its independence, given it has been for the last 2 to 50 years have been occupied by empires, and given the recent history of the Soviet Union during the Second World War, not vacating parts of Iran, there were the book claimed that there were two strategies that were involved. One strategy said that we should tilt towards the United States to maintain our autonomy against the Soviet Union, and the other strategy said that we should maintain a kind of equidistance, if you like, and that was culminated in Musadik. That was the argument of the book. I wonder what your thoughts are about this argument.
Well, I don't want to critique Mr. Vali Nasr. His father had a very close relationship with the Shah's wife, and so the relationship with the former regime was clear. And one of the things that I deal with in the first monologue that I had, because the one that you're putting down below is the second monologue, uh, the Twitter and the YouTube. The first one, which is for last week, deals with certain myths about Iran, and one of those myths that Mr. Valinas actually more recently, or Dr. Valinas has has alluded to, and have others, is this sort of myth of the Iranian regime as always being on the verge of, collapse and at a turning point and at a crossroads and in deep trouble, and we've been hearing that for 40 some years. But the problem really lies in the fact that most of the information, if not all, almost exclusively all of the information comes from Iranians that reside in the West, that work in American institutions, American think tanks, American universities. And of course, that brings about a certain narrative that helps create a certain narrative. And almost nothing comes from within Iran. And that, I think, is one reason why there's such a warped understanding of the country. And of course, it is always encouraged to demonize Iran. And the only people who've actually written that I know, well, maybe a couple of others, but one, a couple who've written a pretty good book on Iran were Flint and Hillary Mann-Leverett, who actually worked in the White House, and they wrote a book called "Going to Tehran," which I would advise your readers to look at. But the reality is that uh, Mossadegh, wanted to, he and his supporters, which were both religious and nationalists, they wanted Iran to be independent, and the West wouldn't allow it, and thus they undermined him. And when Mossadegh was the prime minister, and he had his positive element, he had both positive and negative characteristics. He made mistakes. He was naive about the United States. He also, um, I think, uh, was a bit too harsh on his critics and was unable to, you know, to maintain a broad umbrella as the prime minister of the country, and sort of allowed divisions to grow, and ultimately he was undermined because of that. But he wanted an independent country, and he was demonized by the Western media almost exactly like the Islamic Republic of Iran has been demonized for the last 4.5 decades. If you look at the, like, let's say, the New York Times during his premiership, he was depicted as a madman, a fool, all sorts of horrible attributes uh, were given to him simply because he wanted Iran to be independent. And so not only did they demonize him, but of course, ultimately, they undermined him, and the Shah came to power and did the bidding of the United States. And so I think it's only normal for for Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to be treated like for Prime Minister Mossadegh was treated during his reign. And that's just how it is. I mean, it doesn't matter whether, like, look at Cuba. Why is the United States trying to crush the Cuban people? Simply because it's an independent country. Is Cuba a threat to the United States? Of course not. Is Cuba about to bring about revolution in Latin America? Of course not. In fact, I think that Cuba has many faults that actually prevent it from having I mean, a broader influence. Something which I actually like about Venezuela. So in Venezuela, Catholicism and Christianity and religion and God are not seen as against the policies of the state. So it is a country which, so the state, despite the sanctions, it supports. It tries. I've been to Venezuela on a number of occasions. Despite the difficulties and because of the sanctions to a large degree, they try to help the disenfranchised. But unlike in Cuba, there's no hostility towards. In fact, it's the exact opposite. And President Maduro actually speaks of God and speaks of Jesus, and when speaking about independence and about struggling against hegemony. Uh, so Cuba, it's antagonized, and it's some believe that the U.S. Secretary of State, the reason why he wants to overthrow the Venezuelan government is more because he wants to overthrow Cuba. He's obsessed with Cuba, so he thinks if he can overthrow Venezuela, then Cuba will be easier. So this hatred is basically because Cuba has an independent foreign policy, because Venezuela has an independent foreign policy. So Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, he was antagonized because he was trying to uh, develop Iran as an independent and sovereign country. There was no intended hatred for any particular country. Just as after the revolution, in his first interview with an American, or during the revolution, I'm not quite sure. I'll have to look it up. But Imam Khomeini, he spoke to an American reporter and said, if the Americans behave reasonably towards us, we will preserve our relationship. But unfortunately, from day one after the revolution, the Americans began conspiring against Iran, just as they did against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. But this time round, the Iranian leader was much more sophisticated, and Imam Khomeini was, much more aware of the threat of the American empire, and he prevented them from being able to undermine the country.
I had a follow-up, which is a kind of diversion from how I want to end the conversation, since we have exhausted the time. So maybe I should quickly ask that question for the sake of the comprehensiveness of this segment on Iran. And then maybe if I get the time, I'll ask the diversion. So if you could end by telling a little bit more about Iran's relationship with starting with the PLO, but as the PLO leadership betrayed the broader movement during Oslo, and Hamas rose from the momentum of the first Intifada, but going through that, to talk a little bit about uh, Iran's relationship with these um, oscillation, if you like, of the Palestinian movement and its leadership. That might be interesting to our viewers, because generally the mainstream media has framed this as one large block of Iran and Palestine, but your monologue briefly mentioned some of these twists and turns. So, for instance, I'd be curious to know, how does Iran look at the PA at this moment in history? Because there has been great debates whether it is correct to look at the PA entirely as a collaborator or a colonial police force, or whether the PA should still be considered in the large umbrella of Fatah and even the larger Palestinian movement. So, what is Iran's position vis-a-vis these different segments of the Palestinian movement?
Well, first I should point out that Yasser Arafat, from the Iranian perspective, is not he did not he did not betray Palestine. He made, from the Iranian perspective, key mistakes, and perhaps it was exhaustion in his older age. He felt maybe he was running out of time, and he wanted some sort of solution. But the Iranians believed that compromise would get him nowhere, and ultimately that's what happened. Iran's problems with Yasser Arafat and the PLO began during the war, when the PLO began to they wanted to mediate, but they were gradually tilting towards Saddam Hussein. And then Yasser Arafat had a meeting with the head of the MEK terror organization, which is a cult, and which was fighting as foot soldiers for Saddam Hussein. And these were people who betrayed the country. They carried out many bomb attacks across the country, putting bombs in buses. I remember one morning when I was getting ready to go to school, the windows in our house shattered, and just, I don't know, maybe a few hundred meters away, a bomb had exploded, killing, I don't remember if it was 9 or 11 people, including an Armenian family, a father and mother and their 2 kids. They were taking the kids to school. So, that was something that we were dealing with on a daily basis. It's sort of like ISIS and Jolani when he was blowing up bombs in Iraq and slaughtering people. That's what the MEK was doing. So when he met them, the relationship began soured further. But what really tested the relationship the most was Oslo, and which was also, as I'm sure you know, the result of Saddam Hussein's uh, foolishness, his criminal invasion of Kuwait. Even though Kuwait supported Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran, he invaded Kuwait, and Arafat supported him. And when Saddam was defeated and crushed, and Iraq was crushed, the PLO was severely weakened because of this foolish policy of supporting aggression. And this allowed the Americans to gain the initiative. And we saw the Madrid peace process, which was American led. That, the relationship with the PLO went downhill, but it never ended. And so Iran, right during around the time when they were uh, beginning the U.S. peace process, the Iranians began supporting uh, the Palestinians who rejected the compromise. And Hamas was created around that time, and of course Islamic Jihad was created earlier. So these were groups that gradually moved closer to Iran. But Iran supports all the different Palestinian groups. And actually, when I would visit Damascus, I would sometimes visit the different groups. They have different organizations. And Iran supported all of them. The Palestinian Authority, of course, Iran does not support its policies, but Iran does not cut off ties with any of the groups. And even though Iran considers Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all the other groups to be allies, the religious and secular, but the PA, Iran does have a relationship with it, which it criticizes them, but Iran doesn't believe that they should be the relationship should be broken.
We'll leave it there. Excuse me, I had a very curious question about religion, given my own position of not just being part of the traditional left, but also having read about the politics around religion, and I think in our subsequent discussions and conversations, I would like to explore more about how some of your thoughts are regarding this. But this was a wonderful conversation, Professor Marandi. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always an honor.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.